Well, welcome. We are delighted that you could join us today. There still are plenty of seats up front if you'd like to come up. My name is Ken Ferraro, and on behalf of the Purdue University Center on Aging and the Life Course, it is my pleasure to welcome you here today. We're glad that you could join us. We are going to talk about the topic of elder mistreatment today, and we are delighted to have some of the nation's top experts in this area, so I think you're in for a treat. I hope you enjoy the venue of the Beck Ag Center. I think of it as a retreat center, a nice place to get away from the hustle and bustle and focus in on an important topic. It's also a great time for networking, and everybody got a parking space. The topic of elder mistreatment is something that has attracted the interest of scholars for decades, and human service workers and policy planners have given substantial interest to this topic. We know that elder mistreatment occurs and that it's pernicious, but there are many questions that we don't know about elder mistreatment, and that's what we want to probe today. In light of the changes that we've experienced during the pandemic, I think one question that many of us have is, did it become more prevalent? Did elder mistreatment become more prevalent and more insidious in the last few years? How is this thing mutating? How is it changing? And what are the ways that we can combat that? I think we'll touch on those questions today and many others. And after each speaker, there'll be an opportunity for question and answer, so you might start thinking about your questions that you'd like to pose. On behalf of the Center on Aging and the Life Course, we'd like to acknowledge our sponsors for today's event. We have two of them. And I first want to introduce Professor Marian Liu, who is from the School of Nursing, but she also represents the National Adult Protective Services Association. Marian will also introduce our first speaker. Marian?
Thank you, Ken. Well, so on behalf of the National Adult Protective Services Association's NAPSA's Executive Director, Jennifer Sperry, I have something to read. So NAPSA is a national nonprofit organization with members in all 50 states, DC, and the territories. Formed in 1989, the goal of NAPSA is to provide adult protective services, APS programs, a form of sharing information, solving problems, improving the quality of services for older adults and persons with disabilities who are victims of mistreatment. NAPSA also represents the interest of APS at the national level with the legislative and executive branches of government. NAPSA's mission is to strengthen the capacity of APS at the national, state, and local levels to effectively and efficiently recognize, report, and respond to the needs of older adults and persons with disabilities. So how many of you know of APS, or what do they do? Oh, quite a few of you. I can skip the next section then, but okay, I'm still gonna read it. So what exactly does APS do? APS is statutorily authorized under each state's law to receive and investigate reports of abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation of older adults and people with disabilities. APS works with victims to connect them to appropriate services and help them to understand their options. APS cannot force a victim to participate in the interview or accept services, especially not those who have decisional capacity. APS works closely with a wide variety of allied professionals, including healthcare providers, law enforcement officials, financial institutions, among others, to access community resources to keep seniors and adults with disabilities in their own home. So, the next question, do you know that APS has no dedicated federal funding? Yeah, okay, a little bit, not really. So APS received a first-time direct federal funding as part of the COVID relief funding and the American Rescue Plan Act, and both funding will end pretty soon. So how can you reasonably combat abuse and neglect of older adults and people with disabilities with virtually no money? You really cannot. So NAPSA is asking your help to contact your senators and congressional representatives to demand sufficient funding for APS. I know that we have quite a few APS investigators, supervisors, directors in the audience today. Could you raise your hand? Thank you for coming. So the bottom line is APS saves the lives and assets of vulnerable adults every day, and APS needs your support. So please feel free to reach out and talk to the APS workforce today that's here to understand a little bit more about what they do. All right, now I have the pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Pamela Teester. So Dr. Teester is a professor, the director of the Center for Gerontology, and the interim head for the Department of Human Development and Family Science at Virginia Tech. She has a bachelor's degree in English education, a master's in speech and theater, a certificate in gerontology, and a PhD in public administration and public affairs. And most recently, in 2021, because what do we do in the pandemic, right? She got another master's in clinical bioethics. Dr. Teester is the North American representative of the International Network for the Prevention for Elder Abuse, a fellow of the Gerontological Society of America and the Association for Gerontology in Higher Education, a board member and chair of the Ethics Committee at the National Adult Protective Services Association, a former president of the National Committee for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, and a past president of the Board of Trustees for the Center for Guardianship Certification. She also serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Elder Abuse and Neglect and the Journal of Trauma, Violence, and Abuse Review. She's a recipient of many, many awards in elder justice, from Adult Protective Services, guardianship, to academia as listed in the booklet, to recognize her research, teaching, and engagement with the public. So Dr. Teester has published over 250 scholarly and also translational articles, reports, and book chapters, and is the editor and author of 7 books. She has received funding from numerous public and private sources. Her research interests covered elder and vulnerable adult mistreatment, guardianship, end-of-life decision-making, ethical treatment of older adult, public policy and public affairs, and I can go on and on and on. What I admire most about Dr. Teester is the fact that she has always been ahead of the curve in research topics. So her publication on adult protective services started way back in 2003. Am I right, Pam? So very likely that collaboration started much earlier. Many specific grant opportunities that were released in recent years, including least restrictive guardianship for victims of adult mistreatment, opioid and substance abuse among adult mistreatment cases, all of those topics, before the grant opportunities even exist, Dr. Teester had already investigated all of them before the opportunities came out, and a lot of the times she had provided policy recommendations already. So how can one's research be more cutting edge than this, where funding agencies pretty much follows her career, her research interest, and reference her research in the funding solicitations? So Dr. Teester's talk today, titled The Face and Future of Elder Mistreatment, is based on her newest book that will be coming out in November. So without further ado, let's hear from Dr. Teester about her latest work.
Thank you very much. It's such a privilege to be here today. I think anyone at a land-grant university understands that we have to take our colors everywhere. So I just thought I would do that right now. Marion, it's one of the nicest introductions I've ever had. Thank you. So I want to thank some people before we get started, like Ken Ferraro for having us, and my great bag of chocolate, which is significantly diminished from yesterday when I came to now. We'll see what my family gets, not much. Marion for inviting me, Chris Coleman, who will come around, who is your department head, and Paige Ebner for doing just the nicest set of presentation preparation things. I've almost not seen anything quite that lovely. It's not fussy, it's just perfect. It's just spot on. So I just want to thank everybody for doing that. And if one ever gets to be in the company of Peter Lichtenberg and James Appleby, even for a little bit in the back of a car, it's a great day. So I just want to say that sort of thing. So one just has to be reminded in presentations of people's place and where they're from. And I thought I would just share that with you before I got started, because it does sort of tell you why some of the work that we do gets done, because it's where we live. And that's true for so many researchers, for the students here. So much of the work we do begins because of where we are and what we see around us. One can have a whole research career just in your own backyard, quite frankly. And it would be laudable and wonderful, and you would do great things for the world. So here is where I live. And it is, Virginia is a pretty big state. Once it was a whole bunch of states, actually. And then Kentucky splintered off, and West Virginia splintered off, so it got smaller. But Blacksburg, that little dot there, is where my university is, and we sit in an area called Southwest Virginia. That's pretty important because we sit we sit on a plateau called the Appalachian Plateau, which makes the weather kind of sketchy, but we get all these different wonderful seasons. It's rather mountainous, so when we moved back to Blacksburg, and my son, we all had requests for what the house would look like that we were going to build, and he wanted a walkout basement, and I went, no problem, because the best thing we could do for our yard was actually go sledding in it, otherwise not traversable exactly. So we are between the Blue Ridge and Allegheny Mountains. When the students aren't around, the population of our town is 42,000. But importantly about Virginia, there are some things that are at the top of it called NOVA, or Northern Virginia, that make that pretty important, and that would be Washington. And so that's a whole different world in and of itself. And then to the side, of course, in the east is the Atlantic Ocean. So we have all these sorts of things, and that brings in military and the shipping industry, and that is another tidewater area is what we call that. So there are several distinct areas, but the one geopolitically that gets the least airplay is, guess what? Where I am. Because the whole transportation industry and so forth is much sketchier in that way. And so I just wanted you to know that, to see the industries that are there. Some of them have played out before. A lot of people farm. You have corn, we had tobacco, we had mining. And so some of these issues that finally get studied in relation to this have to do with the very economies that you're watching when you are a researcher at that particular institution. And so I just wanted to let you know about that. So it's a pretty great place to live, however, and it will look like this in a few weeks, by the way. This is where I work. And this is what it looks like in winter, spring, summer, fall, and everybody who knows me knows I love James Taylor. So all his periods, which have been vast. So if you want to know where I am situated, and one of your persons who left here at Purdue, Laura Sands, and went to Virginia Tech where I am, we are most close to one with the little ducks, because her house is right above there now, and our center she walks to every morning. It couldn't be more ideal than that, could it? All right, so that's what our campus looks like, and I picked some stuff for all seasons so you could see what it looks like. We have 9 colleges and a graduate school. 110 undergraduate degree programs, 170 master's and doctoral programs, 37,000-ish students. We have a strong presence now in Northern Virginia and a campus that's being created called the Innovation Campus, and I expect James knows about that probably as much as I do, and an adjacent corporate research center that has worked. They don't always at the universities. I'm the director of the Center for Gerontology. Peter can relate to that, so can Ken. And we have currently, I checked this morning, 14 certificate students in our current certificate program. We've given out about 120 certificates for gerontology. We have now 100 faculty affiliates all around the campus, 18 Futures Board members who guide our work, 10 center associates, which were the word for retired faculty. We came up with a different word. 3 staff associates, because nobody ever included the staff, and we thought it was time to do that. 3 undergraduate associates, that's how many undergrads we have at the time doing research projects with us. About 25 to 30 funded projects running around externally at one time, because we have a great set of people doing great gerontologic work. And 5 core gerontologists who pump out more work than anybody can ever believe. You know, on a given day, I look like a slacker compared to them. You know it's true. And so we would acknowledge, because we are wrestling with these issues, and it will come up when I do this part of my talk, we are wrestling with sitting on Native American land, because that's where our university is, so the Tupelo and Monacan people. And we are also wrestling with having one of the homes that was part of the tour that we have at Virginia Tech, slaveholders. And so we are having to deal with those sorts of issues that many universities are having to deal with because of those issues. So that sort of places us, that is sort of in place of where we are and what we do. Like you, I come from a land-grant university. And like some of you here, maybe, or at least those flags that we were looking at earlier this morning, when I first finished I finished graduate school and got my first professor job, I was the extension specialist for gerontology for the state of Virginia. And I know you wouldn't know that unless I told you, which I just did. So I just thought I would point that out just to let you know a little bit about why that work gets done. And it takes a village, right, to do that. And then, so I just wanted to let you know, we created another certificate in gerontology. We did that right in the middle of a pandemic. And a vision of that was to have a certificate for professionals. So who teaches in that? Melissa, Laura Sands, and Rich Brody and Bob Loncato. These will be people a number of you will know with your work on APS. And that really is catered to people who are administrators but don't know much about aging, or they know a lot about aging but they don't know very much about administration. So it's either one of those, and taught by people who are, not surprising, friends of mine from elder abuse work, Candy Heisler and Georgia Annisberger, who are teaching the ethics class right now, and I'll be teaching in that on Monday night, by the way. So just a little introduction of that, and then as I switch to more on elder abuse, just to say, because I think personally, I think after you get to a sort of certain place in the work that you do, the work and your personal life meld. I used to get really annoyed students in the beginning when I tried to make a clean break between them, and the one kept lurking into the other, and I have given up, right? So I don't know how you feel about that, Ken, but I can't find a separation between them anymore, and I'll just let you figure it out. There's a great quote for that, by the way. But I have one husband, and and that's probably legal, and then I have 2 children. One is 20, he'll be 24 next month. He is a nurse, and he is at Georgetown University Hospital in the ICU. He would probably be asleep now because he will have come off his 4th day of the 12-hour shift. And then I know that you look at me, I have a 13-year-old as well, who did get on the bus on time this morning. So I'm very covered till she comes home this evening and is going to a spaghetti potluck before they run cross country tomorrow. So that just gives you a flavor of what it's like, and I think I kind of want to do this for the students in the room, that I want to tell you what, you can do this. And you can have a rounded life if you choose to have that. We had a wonderful conversation last night at the dinner table about the rounded lives we have. You may see one side of the professor world, but it's a big old thing. And so it has a lot of different pieces and components to it, and you'll be much richer and happier for it. So I just want to say, and it's possible and doable. I feel like if I can do it, you can. So anyway, now I'm going to shift gears, and now I want to talk about a case study, and I want to tell you why I chose it. And then we'll go through this particular set of presentations. I feel like I'm sort of the 40,000 foot up person. And I have been so blessed in my research life. Marion, you pointed it out, but the truth of the matter is I've been so blessed in my research life because I could sort of go my own way. I didn't have to do one component. I did look at self-neglect. I did look at physical misuse. I do look at surrogate decision making, and I'm really lucky to have gotten to do that. When opioids began, that first work was being done, we got to do it. But why? Now you know because you see where we lived. And so we knew about it firsthand because it was coming through the criminal justice system. That's why this is a problem. APS would, but many of you, and bless you, APS is here. And I said to somebody who this morning when we were getting tea, if it weren't for APS, I'd probably not have a career because they started the first study I did and agreed to do it. And when they asked, how many years would you want to run the study? You know what I said? Do you know how much money I had? I had $1,000. I did, Peter. And so I was just making it up. What I had learned from my life in the theater was always have a date for that something's due. And if you don't know it, make it up. And so that's what I did. And do you know that years later, nobody ever questioned it. No one ever. 5 years. Okay. How about that? And so we were able to get the first data on sex abuse of younger, vulnerable, and older adults that had ever been collected in the country. Why? Virginia had it's a mandated reporting state, but what was important about Virginia is they investigated in facilities and communities. So that was the first time anybody had been able to do some comparative work between the two. And then later on, with bake sale money, for those of you who think $1,000 is not a lot, for the work in elder abuse, I always just multiply that. I argue this on my faculty activities report. I know the engineers get millions of dollars to build a bridge, but I want to say that my 50,000 is really 5 million. I'm putting extra digits on that because of the kind of work we do. But I think you need to have your eyes wide open when you kind of understand that. I think you concur, don't you? All right, so I want to talk about the case of Augusta and Dorothy. The names are redacted, but this would be an actual case that occurred. And in our book, we are actually using cases that that people gave to us that actually occurred, and they become the springboard for the writing that we do. So I want to use this one, and I want to tell you why. Because, as you know, this is a controversial opener. Because there are people and scholars and theorists who aren't sure that self-neglect doesn't fall into a very different bucket from elder mistreatment. And so that's just a thought to put in your head. But anybody who works with APS, and all of you who do, know it's the bulk of your casework. And it's also the place where you get slammed by the press more often than any other occasion, which will be on elder self-neglect. And I feel like I should tell you a student's story before I read this, now that I think about it, because I usually do. Back when I was a tender graduate student and had submitted a paper to the Southern Gerontological Society that got selected for the Best Paper Award, and I was thrilled about that, and we got $100 for getting, that was the award. It was so exciting. I felt very knowledgeable because I had gotten that award, and I got it. It was the first publication I ever had, and it was a single author, you know. And so, but I felt very knowledgeable, and here's the issue. It's a dangerous thing. I felt like I understood autonomy and beneficence, non-maleficence, justice. I understood self-determination, person-centeredness, which hadn't even come into vogue at that particular time yet. I felt that I deeply understood, which is why when I was finishing up an internship at the Area Agency on Aging, one of the best of my life, I went out with a policeman and an adult protective services worker, and we climbed in the house of the older adult, in through the window. Because I understood autonomy, beneficence, self-determination. I understood it wrong. I understood it deeply, but it's why, without any kind of order or permission, I just hove my leg right into the window of that woman's house, and it was closed, by the way. And there we were. And then what did we see? Classic self-neglector issues. We looked in the refrigerator. I backed up. Looked scary. Lots of trash. This was not the first time this woman had had a call on her, but here was the funny part. Like in The Wizard of Oz, if you have seen that movie, and they walk like this, we went up the steps to see about this woman who we had been called for. The social worker, not an APS worker at that particular juncture, the police guy was a retired cop, and he was the APS person. The social worker, lovely, lovely person, her name was Carolyn, she would not mind me saying, had a high-pitched Minnie Mouse voice, which really translates to understanding self-neglect. And so when we were going up the steps, she said, and the cop's name was BJ, she goes, BJ, I don't think I've ever seen a dead person before. Do you think she's dead? Now we're in her house. We have opened up a window. We have had no kind of official order or permission to be in there, and yet there we are, 3 people, and I am feeling knowledgeable. We are going up the steps of this house. We go at the top, and we see a hideous-looking bedroom with like a blanket on there and maybe a little mound of something. So Carolyn, and all the sensitivity that she had, goes, "You think she's dead? I think she's dead. What are we going to do, BJ?" I just am quiet because I'm knowledgeable. I'm sensitive. And out from the sound in the house came a voice, and it said this thing, "What are you doing in here?" We all jump back because it scares us to death, as it should have. And that question is a good one from this woman, because what are we doing in there? Do we have a good answer? We don't. But Carolyn, in her Minnie Mouse voice, which I still remember to this day, says, "We just came to see you." It was a bad answer. "We just came to see you. And are you okay?" And she goes, "Now you've seen me. Get out." And what did we do? We turned around and went out the open window and shut it. I stood in the driveway of that house, and I thought about everything that I had violated. Me, the knowing one, I had violated her rights. We all had. What were we doing in that house? Answering a call? We didn't have any permission to break a seal. How ageist had we been for that woman? We just came to see you. Do I open your window to visit? I bet you I don't. No. Did we need to make her sound like we thought she was dead and trivialize that? Because we sort of did. Such lessons to a person who knew things on self-determination. A little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. Application's pretty important. Okay, I felt like I had to get that out because it doesn't buy me any credibility, but I got to tell you how it went. Okay? So now, let's talk about this particular case, which will be familiar to many people in adult protective services. I will read it. Augusta and Dorothy, both in their mid-80s and sisters, had lived together in a private home within a large urban center for over 4 decades. Neither had married nor had any children. Augusta had suffered a stroke a few years back, but both sisters had mental conditions that rendered them homebound and increasingly socially isolated. Think about the themes were already resounding, even in the posters that you all had. Among those conditions were agoraphobia, for which they received no mental health services. Anybody surprised? Their home was filled with clutter from floor to ceiling, leaving livable space limited to a small area and one bedroom. When the toilet stopped working, waste was discarded into bins throughout the bedroom. Everywhere was rotting food, soiled laundry, insects, rodents, and a strong smell of urine and feces. The sisters' only contact was with their next-door neighbor. She stopped by daily to check on them and weekly to bring food, always at the bedroom window. The neighbor was the only person the sisters trusted. After Dorothy fell, the neighbor called paramedics who removed both sisters from the home for medical assessment. The paramedics also contacted local APS to report the sisters' self-neglect and secure other needed assistance. That's a classic self-neglecting case. If APS does nothing and the mayor hears about it, you'll be on the front page the next day, and it won't be pretty, will it? If they have capacity, they'll go right back in that home and have another call in another 2 weeks. And that is how that goes. This is why this little case study, which is very similar to many case studies that APS workers work every day, is very emblematic of a whole series of things that not only I will talk about, but my colleagues will later on in the presentations. So I just want to set that up and let you understand there are huge sets of issues right embedded in this tiny case study that really happened. What happened to the sisters? I really don't know. Can I tell you what I guess? They go in a facility. That's how that will happen. And then what else do we do? What about their home? Will they get a guardian? Will the guardian care? Will they have a hike? It's a huge set of cascading sets of problems that we have yet to resolve. So, I'm going to talk about two pioneers, a little bit of history, that theory issue, disciplinary domains, the individual and their treatment, and no, I didn't get the antecedent wrong. I'm changing how I write. And concluding remarks, and then we have a few time for questions. But again, I'm your 30,000 foot view up. Let's talk about some pioneers, and they are wonderful. I can't do them all. I had a really nice talk with Mary about how we pick these people. It's too long to go in detail, but I have to tell you that all the pioneers we decided to pick were dead. And we figured they couldn't get mad at us for that. So this is the mock-up of the front part of our book. And Marion, just so you know, Toshio Totara's at the top. I expect you recognize that. Also, Betty Lau is at the bottom, Nana Apt, and a French physician who will be in another piece of work that we do. We felt like it's really important to talk about people who've influenced us because they really, really do. I'm going to talk about two people, and I don't even know if any of you know them. Does anybody know him? Does anybody know him? You'd have to be somewhat older if you did. Okay, nobody does. John Regan, I didn't have time this morning to check to see if he ever edited, but it's Elias Cohen, edited TG, but it was another attorney called Elias Cohen. So John Regan was a powerhouse and did really early and important and foundational work on elder abuse and guardianship. I learned, going through and learning about him, that he was a priest earlier in his life and then went to law school. Lucky us for that. Because he did teach us a whole lot of things about older people, and it was early on in his work. But the themes that we're going to see pull through this particular part of the discussion, you will see them coming up again and again. So let's look at look at the work. Financial planning for the elderly. If we are studying elder exploitation, you're in his debt, because he did some of the early work on this particular issue. And notice of the things that he wrote. Tax estate. So where did that tradition come from? Came from the law, right? So it would be a very legalistic. The part I had actually read when I was a student would be the lower things, which I had read, which was Reagan and Springer's book on protective services for the elderly. And all of you in APS, he was doing work on that and thinking about those issues even then. And then look at the last one, not a compliment, because here's where the ethics and the law come in. Protecting the elderly, the new paternalism. We wouldn't even use the word elderly now, right? But that is what was going on at that particular time. So it isn't that he is not sensitive, very sensitive, just not that particular day. And so he wrote, The manner in which a society behaves with its older people unequivocally reveals the truth, often carefully masked, of its principles and its ends. It was his opening line in the Reagan and Springer book with Simone de Beauvoir, and that's who he's quoting. He talked about protective services of the elderly, and he talked about federal funding for them, and you're still talking about it, and it's 2022. So when he wrote those particular things, he talks about the importance of the state-focused APS program. I know you don't feel this, but in his ideas, and even in some of my own, it has to do with states being sensitive to the needs of the people who are there and localities. So you may not always like state-focused APS. It's a nightmare to study at a national level, by the way. But I want to tell you that there's some rationale to that. You'll watch federal assistance, but it's a state issue, and it comes up to haunt other things as well. When he was writing with Georgia Springer in Protective Services for the Elderly, he talked about institutionalization. Think of what we're doing now. Institutionalization of old people. We don't do that anymore. 3 million people needing services by APS, and you know that number was in the 1970s. He was talking about issues of incapacity and proceedings, and noted that when people got a guardianship, it was done with casual concern to lose every right you have. Issues related to institutionalization, again, which was need for services, and that's also the other thing he talked about. This was in the 70s, so we're still talking about those kinds of things, aren't we? But he was a powerhouse, and all of us who've studied financial exploitation have Reagan in our debt, by the way. Probably a life that was snuffed out too soon. How many of you know Rosalie or ever met her? It'd be me and a couple of people. So Rosalie Wolf was another early powerhouse in the work that was ever done on elder abuse. Did you get an award for her? Did you get it? Yeah. So at least 2 of us in this room have had an award from her, and that is one of the highlights of anybody's life if you were ever selected for it. She was amazing, and I got to work with her at the end of her days. I got to know her through what you'll see up here of the things that she did. This is a tiny little list, but they're really important things. She began the Journal of Elder Abuse and Neglect, which many of us have published in to this day. She was the original editor of that particular book. We now call it Gene. She began the National Committee for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, called NCPE, by the way. She was its first president, and she stayed president until she died. The second president was Bob Blancato. The third president was Randy Thomas, who was a cop, and the fourth president was me. And then the organization started disbanding, so I don't know how connected that is. But anyway, that was the National Committee. It was a multidisciplinary team of APS and researchers and the American Bar Association. It was conceived to be the nation's multidisciplinary team. Rosalie also founded INPIA, which is the International Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse. She was its first president, and then Gloria Gutman was president of that. Also, Leah Dykeman was president of that, and today it's Susan Summers. So she started these things. Going out to the people from GSA, she won the Don Can Award. Isn't that grand? And she deserved every moment of it. She testified a lot. She was a very lovely, lovely person. We learned when she died that her husband and her family had no idea that she did this work. Isn't that funny? They didn't. They had no idea. She also played in an orchestra. Nobody knew that about her either. And so she was this wonderful person. And if you look about the people she works with, she will be a friend to, she will have worked and did early work with a great friend of many of us in this room, Carl Pilmer, who did early work in elder abuse. Another fun fact as we're moving along and understanding things, Carl Pilmer was head of the GSA Public Policy Committee when I was a student, and that was the first time I met him. I thought he was a god. I really did. Okay, there you go. Anyway, she did some of the early and really important studies on elder abuse that were ever done, and there can't hardly be any of us that are not in her debt in some ways. She was a field uniter, and when she died, again, way too early, things in the elder abuse world changed a great deal because you had this really wonderful early person that sort of solidified the field. history matters, doesn't it? And I think it's important for me to be able to talk with you about that, hence the History Matters sign and the grading, because I think that's kind of evil of me, but I did it anyway. So just to point that out. So about history, I graded the side I graded the much older side and didn't the other. But I looked for a presentation for this. I wanted to look at some historical documents that showed a lot about what people had been saying about the progression of the field. So I had to go back to people who actually had this stuff just like in their files. It wasn't digitized. I had to go call in some friends to give me information. So just to look through here, what you're seeing, Rosalie wrote this in 1988, and it was 10 years, it actually was 10 years earlier that she was commenting on, miserable. This issue had not really bubbled up in the public consciousness, so little action by Congress. Media coverage was about what we got. Substantial amount was unreported. Think about where we are now, because this is kind of interesting to watch what people are saying. Rosalie's disciplinary heritage, by the way, was from social welfare, and she graduated from Brandeis University in the social welfare. She then wrote about 10 years later another document to say, where are we now? And when she did that particular work, she published that apparently for Institute in Aging in Worcester. So it wasn't a congressional work that she did at that particular time for the National Welfare Association, which, by the way, Toshio Totaro was from. She then talked, and must have self-published it at the institute she was head of. So now look what we're looking. Definitional issues, international efforts, might be a good idea. Look at risk factors and causality. Prevalence and incidence. There was never a prevalence and incidence study at this time. We didn't have a clue. Service delivery and the precarity of APS. There you are. An overall level of interest in the topic. I gave it a progress grade of B-. I grade stuff. It's right. Okay. Ariella Lowenstein received a Rosalie Wolf Award. This was published in Gene when she got it, and here's what she talked about. Lack of awareness of aging and elder abuse, still around. Need for unifying research framework, well, we still need that. Need for partners and patrons. We were always looking for some really wealthy actress or actor who'd take this on, because that would give us some money, because we weren't getting federal funding at this time. And look what's popping up more, international. Why? Because Ariella is at the University of Haifa, so she understands that. She's also with Izzy Doran, for any of you who know him. Then a medical doctor, Price, published this in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society, but it was one of the early things that really talked about emphasis on financial exploitation as a major subtype. But it's coming from the medical community, and I think that's an interesting component of that. Progress grade, I gave it a C. Not so much. All right, and so then, again known to many of you, was Jinshi Dong, who was at Rush University at the time, who was a policy fellow in Washington, and so also with an MPH for UN Public Health, again a medical doctor, and here's what he's saying. Now look at the timing. The Older Americans Act and the Elder Justice Act had finally been passed after how many iterations of that? Thank you, M.T. Conley and Bob Blancato and a host of other people. Population research and longitudinal research was needed. He would say that because of his training in public health, right? And standardization and unification of APS databases. Well, okay, so that laid the groundwork for NAMers, right? That theory problem has plagued the field a lot. I could probably do a whole lecture, and I've certainly run through a bunch of papers on theoretical constructs. And finally, at the end of the day, we just made one ourselves. So that's what you're seeing here. Our particular sets of theoretical constructs. When my partner that you know so well, Jill, Karen Roberto, and I wrote a paper and devised our own theory, I walked into Karen's office one day, by the way, when we were working on that paper, she goes, "Are you proposing that we should just make our own theory?" And I went, "Why not?" So we did. But I want to let you see about the theoretical issues that have come forward. When we did our first paper and published it in 2017, we found of 5 years of Gene articles, half of them, 54%, had no theory whatsoever. And that's not that long ago. And if they use theories, they generally use some version of the ecological model. 10 use multiple theories, and some used some theories of dependency were the 6 that we found. So we found over half the articles that showed up in here didn't even have this. It's understandable from the disciplinary perspectives that people are coming from, but it was a push for the field. We had to do what you have had to do in all of your courses. Why does theory matter? It's 101 graduate school work. All right, so these particular models and theories were really important. The caregiver stress theories, aka Leonard Perlin's work, and why that gets a bad rap is most people just think of the burden issue of it, and they don't think of the holistic part of that model. So don't give up on that one. Ecological theories, which is the micro, meso, macro, exo, chronosystems coming out of Yuri Bronfenbrenner's work. These are important because they capture the whole picture of the mistreatment. National Academies of Science work. If you didn't have the book by Bonnie and Wallace in your grant proposal, you would have crashed and burned. But this was a seminal and important work. A panel did this particular work, and they looked at relationships. One of your posters was on relationships. They looked at relationships, and they drove that into their model. International perspectives have a lot to do with rights and self-determination, a lot. And then we borrowed stuff, badly or good, for better or good. Child abuse, intimate partner violence. We use feminist-informed theories. We use public health. And then we got to the one that Karen and I proposed, which looks a lot like Yuri Bronfenbrenner, but we changed it up some. I know people are testing it because I'm reading their manuscripts. I always give them a better grade. Kidding. So I want to talk about disciplinary influences in a little bit of time I've got left too. Social work, medicine, law, criminal justice, psychology, sociology, and ethics and rights. So these fields approach this differently. These fields get funding differentially to approach these issues. And I just want to say that when you approach the problem of elder abuse, it has a lot to do with the disciplinary heritage of the people doing that work, right? That's why to look at that and look at the strands across is sort of to understand why the studies get done the way they are. So I just want to point that one out. And the issue is try to see if everybody can play in the same sandbox. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So where do we end up now? And this is where I want to set up my colleagues. I want to talk about where we're going now. So you've looked at the history, you've looked at the theoretical components, you understand the issues that are there, and now I want to talk about where we're kind of headed. And that's the way I'm setting you all up, by the way. So focus on the individual for one thing, and not problematizing the problem of elder abuse. So we're going to try to look at it a little differently now than we have. So we're going to focus on rights. This comes from the legalistic heritage. Now, you know, it really started a lot in that realm, but we're going to focus on the rights of older persons. We're going to take a term now that is flowing through the rights literature called supported decision making, meaning we have people who can help you make a decision, but we don't need to take away all your rights to do it. Could a supporter help you do that? That's permeating law in some states. It's certainly permeating the guardianship work when APS refers for guardianship. This word intersectionality, things coming together. So you're not just old, you're not just living in a rural area, you're not just African American or Chinese or Muslim, but you have this intersection of issues, and this creates a problem. You're not now a victim. I got dinged from APS on a blog we just put out last week, this week, and they told me I couldn't use the word victim. And I went, okay, let me think about that. All right, and then DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. For many studies, it was because it was convenient for us to do it, but gender, race, and place begin to matter a lot in our analysis now and should be top of mind when we're looking at those particular issues. So, where do I want to leave you so you can have more discussion and we can talk about it in Q&A? I'm going to say start with ourselves and addressing lessons from COVID. We have learned things. We know the long-term care system was fractured. I had no idea it was such a big fracture. It needs resuscitation. Explore the effects of ageism and deeply so. A really nice paper by Carl Pilmer, David Burns, and the author I'm going to forget talks about a methodology and a model for studying this, and that is critical and important as we go forward. Consider the face of the problem and empower the older person. We've been so busy telling the old person what to do and how to handle the perpetrator, but there's a human being in there, and even if they don't have complete decisional capacity, they have preferences and values, and it might be time that we listen to what they say for a change. It's harder. It's not nearly as easy as just bamming them with services or getting them out of the house. And reframing the problem of elder abuse by ending the othering and thinking about the problem differently. And also all the antecedents around why we would have it. These are the things I think that we need to think about as we look at the future and face of elder abuse. Far more on the person and the preference. Thank goodness we've gotten to that place. But we also have to think about what are the societal factors that influence this problem. It didn't just happen. Why? Does it continue? And what interventions are appropriate? Just training? Let's quit doing just training for training's sake. We've been doing that forever, and as a matter of fact, our outcomes have been fairly morose. Let's think carefully now about what kinds of interventions and issues matter. Let's empower the older person or the person who is the subject of the abuse. Let's think about perpetrators. We still don't have enough data to do that. So, and that could be a real key to trying to, if we didn't have a perpetrator, we wouldn't have a person who was a victim. I'm using those words again. APS will get me for that. All right, so I'm at my time, in fact, a little past it, but I would be happy to answer any questions that you have or thoughts that you have. But the face of elder abuse has moved to the face of the people involved, as well as the outward-facing part of what are societal factors, big ageism, that comes in to address that issue. And the way we reframe the problem, as I know James Appleby will tell you later, will have a lot to do with the way we go after the problems. I'm done. Ask questions. Yes, Jill.
Can you stand up? Or? You can stand up. Here comes the mic. So if you could, if you could make this happen, when you think of funded research going forward for the next decade in elder maltreatment, what would you like to see that research focused on? Or what do you think would be most fruitful?
That's a great question. I really would like to see research that looks at poly-victimization, and I didn't talk too much about that, but I would like to see research that looks at people who have been abused in multiple ways over time, and follow them if it's possible to see what was done for them and what wasn't done for them. When we did the sex abuse study a gajillion years ago, you know what the most popular intervention was? You ready? Nothing. That was the one that was most frequently done. The other one was they always blamed the victim and moved them. The perpetrator didn't go anywhere. So I would like to see that we could follow longitudinally, but I would like to see us look at multiple abuses within a single case and how we've addressed that, because I think we have not done that in a good way with a theoretical construct, maybe the contextual theory of elder abuse undergirding the research. Put that down there. Why not? Thank you. It's a good question. Yes, there's somebody way in the back.
What has your organizations and research done with regard to the institutional abuse because of the nursing homes, which are investments are made in those, and for some reason or other, those persons have been protected politically from being prosecuted. What are you doing with regard to the institutional economic rewards of elderly abuse?
Well, not nearly enough. It's hard even to get studies and numbers of abuse because you're frozen out of it. I'll give you an example. When we were doing, got an NIA study to study sexual abuse of vulnerable adults in institutions. There's a lovely thing to look at. When I went out to talk to one of the APS people in Oregon, she told me that there was an attorney for the nursing homes that would like to speak with me. They had some issues, and I knew what that meant. They didn't like it. And so she had somehow gotten hold of my study instrument and proceeded to, in that meeting, go over my whole study instrument with me and why she didn't like it. You know, and what did I say? What would I have said to that? Because that, you know, she could call the right congressman and shut that study down. It could have happened that way. I didn't. I told her thank you very much, and I never changed a thing. But the lobbying and the money and the power is great. And so getting in to study that issue fairly and faithfully is a big challenge. I think we just keep trying to get in there and look at that. I think there will be a renewed effort to try to look at that issue because of what we've learned from COVID. We'll see. Everything you bring up, sir, is absolutely a legitimate issue. I don't have a great answer for you, but me, like others, will try to get in there and do some work. Catherine Hawes is one of the people who's done work. It's forever ago. Yes, thank you.
I just have a word issue.
Okay.
20 years ago, my 95-year-old mother-in-law told me, don't use elder, don't use senior citizen. And I said, well, what am I supposed to say? And she said, older. Older than dirt, but just older.
Rosemary,
I agree with it now that I'm older.
I think I do too. I think I do too now that I am too. Great comment. Rosemary Bleasner is the person who told me to use the word old people, and Tony Calisani. And I was like, really? Is that okay to write? I don't know if I can. But I did a little. Any other questions?
Yeah, Pam, could you comment, you mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic, and just wondering, are there 2 or 3 takeaways, insights that you could share as it relates to how COVID-19 has impacted this issue?
Lucky for you, there's a presentation I've done for that, and me. Yeah, there are some insights, and there are probably more questions than answers about what has happened. But one of the insights is a positive one, so I hate leaving you with all negative things. But one of the positive ones was the realization that we all need each other a little more than we thought we did, that social isolation and loneliness are really public health issues, and that we had better take that one on, and we had better take that one on with a little more robust ways than throwing out a congregate meal site. Maybe we should work on that particular thing. The second thing, I think, particularly in the elder abuse realm, was what I said were the problems with facilities and institutionalization of old people. That one is just, we saw that become worse. And because the ombudsman couldn't get in, families couldn't get in, we couldn't even calculate how people died in those facilities. Some of that early stuff that happened in COVID back in 2020 was awful. It was the best, but the most flaming editorial letter I've ever written at the Journal of the American Geriatric Society. They wouldn't even publish it till we toned it down. We were like, you all are on fire. But we were talking about treatment of people and how that we felt like it was a form of elder abuse. That was the argument we made. Other lessons that we've learned, I think, and I'll just maybe do 3, and probably pertinent to elder abuse, we still don't know those numbers, we think that there are more issues of self-neglect and mistreatment coming down the pike because of COVID. We think that. So our studies are going to lag the issue that has happened. And so we think that we're going to have to look at that differently. What I think also, and this is my editorialization of just doing a preliminary exam with a student 2 days ago and another one this afternoon, I think the effects of COVID are going to be much more profound than we think it has. We want to put it past us, right? Except James and I were talking in the car. His brother had it. I had it. I got it 1st of August. Finally, it got me. Two vaxes and 2 boosts later, there I was. I hated that. I was so angry about it for a while. But I think the effects in our educational system, the nurses in the room, there were people who didn't get trained on stuff. The doctors didn't get trained on stuff. I think the effects of this are going to live with us for a very much longer than we wish it would, and I think we're going to have to take that into account into a lot of the things that we do. Also, one more good thing for anybody who does qualitative research, you now do not have to buzz all around the country to get your research subjects. And so that, unless you want to, that is a gift. So it changed the nature of research in a lot of ways before, and I think some of that has made it better. Yeah. Other questions? You can pretty well ask anything. I may not answer it, though. Okay.
Thank you so much, Pam. That was really thoughtful and gives us a lot to ponder. I want to...
Beautiful day outside. Yes, but you're in here, but for really important reasons. I just wanted to bring you greetings from the Purdue School of Nursing and to say how proud we are of sponsoring this incredibly important symposium. The work that the center has been doing since 1985 is just phenomenal, and the growth in scholarship and our clinical knowledge, and the more we learn each day about all the questions that we still need to research and answer, just really underscores the importance of this work here today. I also want to add that nurses, as you know, we intersect along the life course with everyone from birth to death. And so we work hard to train our students about the importance of understanding the life course of individuals along the way and all the different changes that happen. And we proudly have some superstars in our school, which I'm going to call on them. They didn't know I was going to do that, but I can't help it. So Dr. Marion Liu, I think you met her. There she is, hiding up front. And she is an absolute scholar, an absolute superstar who's really going to move the field forward. And she just personifies all of the excellence that we have in the School of Nursing, and I'm sure also with the various organizations that she is attached to. I also want to highlight another superstar in our School of Nursing, Dr. Nancy Edwards, who's hiding way in the back. Stand up, Nancy. You're not going to... So Dr. Edwards is the director of assistant head of our graduate programs, and she oversees actually our gerontological nursing practitioner program, she is really responsible for ensuring that those students are prepared to go out and provide comprehensive health care to older adults. So again, I won't say too much more, but I just wanted to thank you for allowing me to come up and just say good morning to all of you and have a wonderful symposium. And this work is so important, and I'm glad to see so many young people here. That's fantastic, because you are the future. We're going to be looking for you to carry this work forward. So thank you very much, and have a fantastic symposium.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Heather Mucci, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Purdue School of Nursing. And it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Lichtenberg. It was hard to find something to say that wasn't already available online because in addition to being exceedingly prolific, he is also exceedingly public. He's a man who seems to have about 48 hours in each of his days. A clinical psychologist trained in geriatric neuropsychology here at Purdue, a diplomate in rehabilitation psychology, and one of the first board-certified clinical geropsychologists who advanced the practice of psychology across a variety of areas, including Alzheimer's, medical rehabilitation, and late life depression. He is the director of both the Merrill Palmer Skillman Institute and the Institute of Gerontology, the creator and founding director of the Wayne State University Lifespan Alliance, and the 2022 president of the Gerontological Society of America. It's a lot to lead. He is the deserving recipient of multiple awards for service as a faculty member, graduate mentor, community activist, and for his professional service. Dr. Lichtenberg is the author of 7 books, authored or co-authored over 200 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters. He has published articles on psychological vulnerability and fraud and is nationally known for his work on financial decision-making capacity and undue influence, and that work got me through my comprehensive exams, so I am personally grateful. He has conducted independent medical evaluations and provided expert witness work over 200 times in the past decade, and has taught clinicians across the nation on improving assessments of capacity and financial exploitation. Dr. Lichtenberg is a national expert in financial capacity assessment and financial exploitation of older adults. His bio points out that he is particularly interested in the area of intersection between financial capacity and financial exploitation, finding ways to balance autonomy and protection of older adults. He is the titular creator of the Lichtenberg Financial Decision-Making Rating Scale and the Lichtenberg Financial Decision Screening Scale, tools to be used to assess major financial decisions and/or transactions of older adults. He is the contributor and creator of initiatives to protect older adults from financial exploitation, including the website olderadultnestegg.com and Successful Aging Through Financial Empowerment, or SAFE program, which partners a multidisciplinary team of social workers, financial experts, and clinical psychologists for one-on-one counseling to victims of scams and identity theft. We are all very fortunate to hear from Dr. Lichtenberg today as he discusses the domains of financial capacity, a person-centered approach to preventing fraud.
Thank you so much. Thank you so very much, Heather. Can everybody hear me back there? Are we good? Great. My motto, since I have a soft voice, is carry a very good microphone. And I am just delighted to be here. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Marion, for the invitation. It's great to come back to Purdue, which I left in 1986 after I got my doctorate in clinical psychology. And so it's absolutely wonderful to be here. And there's 2 reasons why I really wanted to share this old photo. One is that when I was at Purdue, the woman on the far right, I visited very often. That's my grandmother, who lived in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where my dad grew up. And nothing that my wife and I like better than heading over there, because my grandmother, who was in her 90s, would tell us the latest books and movies to read, see, and get us otherwise on the right track. But the other reason that I love this slide is this is the first generation that was incredibly visible growing older. When she was born, there were roughly 4 million adults over the age of 65 in the United States. When she turned 75, that number was 20 million. So just a dramatic increase. Now, when she turned 75, she said, boy, I've lived a blessed life. I could be taken any time, very fulfilling. Okay, that night she blew out all 75 candles, and she did that 80, 85, 90. Those are her 2 siblings. They all lived into their 90s, 98, 96, and 94. And so what a great set of role models. For a cohort effect, my great uncle Nat, one of his highlights of his career was defending Mae West. Now some of the older people in the audience understand that. Now I'm going to be talking about neurocognitive issues, decision making, the context within which we do it. So it's important to understand the brain. It works from the moment you're born until you stand up to speak in public. I want you to remember that and be kind. We're going to explore the domains of financial capacity. What do I mean by that? You know, there's been a lot written by psychologists and neuropsychologists about what is financial capacity. And really, it's kind of all the elements that make people successful in their lives dealing with finances. But when it comes down to it, I think it really breaks out into 3 parts. Can you avoid becoming financially exploited? Can you manage your finances? And can you make informed financial decisions? And those are really the areas that we're going to talk about. Everything else is kind of research that is hoping to amplify on those topics. You know, it's very hard to follow a speaker like Pam Teefster. Nobody can tell a story the way Pam can. And one of the things that she said, of course, is that none of us does any of this by ourselves. And I've had such incredible colleagues. These are just my geropsychology colleagues that have been involved in our work in multiple different ways and as advisors. And these are my colleagues from the Michigan Adult Protective Services, and actually I could fill out a few pages on that. But these guys have been real champions, and I really have appreciated that and learned so much. Special acknowledgement to Mickey Iris. Mickey Iris should be recognized as one of those seminal people in elder abuse and guardianship. 1988, she sat in on guardianship hearings and wrote a paper about, well, what really happens? Basically, if nobody shows up to dispute it, guardianship was awarded. If it's disputed, usually there's some kind of negotiation, and it was a little bit more limited. Well, we talked about those domains of financial capacity, and when we're talking about financial exploitation, financial management, decision making, problems creep in when there's early cognitive decline. And we're going to keep coming back to that over and over. It's not the only time that exploitation occurs, of course, but it really starts to muddy the waters. So let's give our financial exploitation definition: misappropriation, misuse of funds of the older and or vulnerable adult. And I'm going to include fraud in here as well as family and friend exploitation, but I'm not including identity theft because there's no real interactions in that regard. Often, that's not always true, actually. In our SAFE program, what we learn is that a lot of times identity theft is within the family or friend network. Wow, you know, that blew our minds a little bit. Ken Conrad, Mickey Iris came up with this conceptual framework for financial exploitation. I think it's a very important framework. It starts with, how do you lose the money? Either somebody steals it or they deceive you into giving it to them. But the next three are really kind of the mechanism. How this happens. How does this unfold? Abuse of trust. So think about that. You're in a trusting relationship that's then abused, and that's how you get exploited. Think of the impact that that has on all kinds of aspects of your life. Think about abuse of trust. Of course, we think about it in families, but it also refers to professions of every ilk. And that's what's kind of like, oh, wow, that could be really frightening then when somebody who is a professional working with an older person really starts to realize, oh, they're a little bit vulnerable. I'm going to take this trust. My life requires me to have a little more income, so I'm going to deceive them and get that. Financial entitlement more specifically refers to how some adult children perceive their older parents' finances. That is, let's say all of a sudden now my mom needs me to drive her to the doctor. And I think my mom should be driven in style. So let me get a nice $45,000 SUV from her funds, of course. And I'll keep it so that it's safe, you know. And every month I'll take her to the doctor. That's a little bit of entitlement. But more so, what's pernicious about this is some older adults, especially when they start having their parents become more vulnerable, really feel like this is my parents', this is my inheritance, and I'm just spending it early. And people really feel that way. Now, you and I know that's theft, but I have to say, I think that this idea is becoming more the norm. In a New York Times article that was really a great kind of classic on ageism, when it was all about older adults who had gotten their first vaccine shots and now we're going out and having a great time. And one of the quotes that the New York Times put in there was, yeah, my parents are going out and spending my inheritance. So when we talk with older people, we ask everybody, hey, how many of you sit down with your kids and talk about your finances and so forth? We have about 20% that do. It's all above board. We all get along. Everybody knows. We're all jealous of those people because the other 80% of us say, well, if my kids knew I had money, they'd want it, so I don't really let them know. So this is difficult because finances has become more and more of a taboo topic. Talking about money, planning money. How do you plan for financial safety? And if there's no communication about it, what does that lead to? You're going to see some data that says that older people often wish they had someone to talk to about finances. And the scammers know this. They know this so well. And they find ways to engender that trust and that connection to get older people to talk about finances. The third, coercion, is a little bit more pernicious. That undue influence, how do you overtake somebody's free will and substitute your own? It's pretty vicious. I mean, you really isolate the person. You have a very confidential relationship, especially around money. And you sort of take control of their lives. Obviously, the older person is going to have to be pretty significantly impaired or dependent in order for this to happen. The last two in the model are really kind of risk factors for exploitation. Some good questions you might ask to just sort of probe for financial exploitation. And also, look at that one, financial management. We're going to keep coming back to these three areas. Well, we learn a lot about financial exploitation by suspicious activities reports. These are federally required reports by the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau by two types of financial institutions: money services businesses like MoneyGram, Western Union, and banks and credit unions as a deposit institutions. And interestingly, between 2013 and 2017, the number of suspicious activity reports quadrupled each month. So when we looked at the 12-month span of 2013 versus 2017, you see the 4 times more reported cases per month. Does that mean that there's 4 times as much exploitation? I don't think so. It's probably a combination of more exploitation, but better detection, more sensitivity in the financial industry. So that's a good thing. But the losses are primarily to older adults. And we see that a third of them are adults over the age of 80. Now, we talk about the pandemic. Here's a pattern that was in the last suspicious activity reports publication by CFPB that's changed a lot. It used to be the money services businesses, that was mostly strangers. So that's where you know, wiring money for a lottery scam or a romance scam. And in the deposit institutions, it was people that you knew. So somebody was taking the older person to the bank for a withdrawal, that kind of thing. Now, during the pandemic, that's changed a lot. the deposit institutions are telling us they are seeing so much in terms of romance scams and other kinds of scams. And so now we're starting to see that both types of services seeing a lot more stranger kind of scams. Everybody's interested in the number. Like, how much is there? But how would you study it, okay? I mean, one of the things that we put in several of our papers is we have some of the few data on confirmed exploitation cases. We actually are looking at people's records, so we know they got exploited. And Ron Asciano hates to present on his prevalence study. Everybody cites it, but I got to hear him speak about it. He was very sheepish. He said, you know, this is all self-report. I have no idea how accurate this is. And I think the number isn't the important thing. It's really, we found out how relatively common it is. Second only to emotional abuse and or self-neglect. So financial exploitation is often thought of outside the area of typical elder abuse. It's only now becoming more and more mainstream in elder abuse conversation, and that's because it touches such a bigger scope than traditional elder abuse. So we had the opportunity, you know, serendipity, as James loves to say, is important. I sat on a plane next to someone I was telling, I'm learning so much about financial exploitation in older adults. He says, as a neuropsychologist, a clinician, somebody that has been approached by attorneys for evaluation, I realized when I started doing that in the probate system, how much exploitation there really was, how dark the negative side of capacity assessment really could be. So I said, oh boy, I got to learn this whole other thing. I got to, you know, get myself up to speed. And indeed, I started to do that. So I was telling this person, hey, you know, we really need to understand fraud better. And well, they went back and put a couple of questions into the leave behind questionnaire of the Health and Retirement Survey. And so we had some of the first data to take a look at what people said about being defrauded and what predicted that. Great thing about the Health and Retirement Survey is it's longitudinal, so you could take predictors from a couple years before and see what predicted it. And what we found was that psychological vulnerability was the strongest predictor. And that was a combination of a higher level of depression, self-reported, and interestingly, the second part was more about social needs and lower levels of a sense of status, or what's called behavioral confirmation. That is, other people telling you what you do is important. So if I have a high depression and low confirmation or status, that's a good invisibility quotient, I think, for older people. And invisibility can really lead to higher rate of exploitation. So when we went to create our tools, and we created our tools because, you know, when you go to court, the question is, doctor, when this older person signed the contract, did they have capacity? And all the scales that were available were kind of traditional, kind of hypothetical scenarios. You know, can the person write out a check, balance a checkbook, and you know, if I tell them about a telephone scam, can they figure out that that's a scam? But never about the question itself. And so we said, let's give it a try. We're going to try to create a person-centered tool that actually analyzes the actual decision or set of decisions a person's making. And at the heart of this tool, because this is the heart of almost every legal standard across the different states is informed decision making. And what is informed decision making? It's not just knowing what you want to do. And that oftentimes that's where people stop. You know, she wants to give this money away. She wants to do that. She can tell me that. So she has capacity. Not quite as simple as that. And it's not just why either, you know, because as early on, an APS person said to me, Peter, I like your scale. You know, older people that I work with make their decisions with their heart. They know what they want to do. They know why they want to do it, but you're making them put their head into it. And that's what informed decision making makes you do. Can you understand and appreciate the decision you're making, the potential consequences of it, the ramifications, how it might impact, how much risk is there? And so we asked Ken Conrad, Mickey Iris, to come help us to do a concept mapping method, and all those colleagues that I showed you helped us, and more, to come up with a conceptual model for financial decision making. And at the heart of it are those Applebaum and Grisso intellectual factors that we talked about. But on the left-hand side is the contextual factors that really start to change how we think about decision making. Remember, we had psychological vulnerability was a predictor. Cognition in that sample wasn't. There really were very few people who had any kind of cognitive problems in that sample, and it really wasn't a predictor at all. So we knew we had to be broader than just the intellectual parts. And the contextual parts matter, right? When you make decisions, it's not just, oh, I'm going to sit down and think about this. You know, how confident am I in my own decision-making abilities? You know, how anxiety producing is it for me to make a decision, so forth. Well, let me give you some examples of some national data. We had the Health and Retirement Survey put in an experimental module for us in 2018 that asked some of these contextual questions. We only got 6 questions. Couldn't ask all of our 34, much as we wanted. But these were really telling. About 2/3 of people said, you know, at least sometimes I'm anxious about my financial decision making. Over half wish they had someone to talk to about financial decisions. And a third had some worry about someone taking away their financial freedom. So a lot of anxiety about money. And we found this too. You know, I do a lot of my own data collection because I really want to get a feel for this. And I don't care if I'm in the wealthiest suburbs of Detroit where I live or in some of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. There's a lot of anxiety about money for a lot of different reasons. And these national data kind of reflect that. And financial decision making and financial decision making deficits seem to line up with financial exploitation. So in this community sample, we had about 36 cases. We do a consensus conference to decide whether this would meet the standards for reporting to APS. And in this sample, we had about 36 cases that we thought it did. And sure enough, they were showing significant signs of financial decision-making deficits on all of our subscales. And when we looked at, because we're neuropsychologists, we had to give them a bunch of cognitive tests. And when we looked, none of them had dementia. However, some seemed to have what we called possible cognitive decline. And the rate of exploitation was double in that group. Well, that was a nice scale for psychologists, and it's being used now by lots of psychologists when they do capacity assessment. But we really wanted to try to make something. I kept thinking, well, How about the Western Union guy? Couldn't they just ask a few questions before they wire over $200,000 to God knows where? So can we take some of our items and create a screening scale? And that's what we did. So these are core items to the bigger scale, but these are the items that we've been blessed that Michigan APS has adopted as a best practice tool and given us a lot of information about. And I'm proud to say that thanks to my hero in the third row there, or fourth row back there, Indiana APS is doing some training on this as well. Thank you, hero. I appreciate that. What financial decision are you making? So there's that choice. We do get a little bit of autonomy. Was it your idea or somebody else's? What's the purpose? Try to get at that rationale. What's the primary financial goal? How will this impact you financially now and over time? So those are understanding questions. How much risk is there to your financial well-being? Who else might it impact? So you get a sense of some of the understanding, appreciation. It's a great way to get the conversation started, a great baseline for what to ask in a kind of a non-threatening way. And we decided with our group, they said, you know, semi-structured approaches are really tough for translate and to replicate. So let's try a multiple choice approach. And that's what we decided to do on all the items. And I have to say, I didn't think of that. This was the great experts that I was working with. Thought of all the cool stuff in our scale, especially Jennifer Moy, who I give so much credit to. And there's how much risk is there to your financial well-being with this decision? Low risk or none, moderate, high risk. This is a rating scale, so it's not only the older person's story that we want, but the interviewer is making a rating on what is the most accurate answer. And we're comparing those two, and that gets at risk as well. So we did a bunch of publications where APS workers used the scale but didn't score it, didn't know how to score it, just used it and made their own decisions about the cases. And that seemed to work out pretty well. When we scored it and we compared them, we found, hey, decision-making deficits are present in a number of APS substantiated cases. And so that gave us the confidence to go forward and actually try to implement it. So the whole field of implementation science is still relatively new. And the whole thing is, like, if evidence was just enough, everybody'd do it, right? Read the paper, say, yeah, great. Go back, start, hey, I got to do this now. But that's not the way it works for anything. And so how do things get implemented? And we've published a couple of papers on this, including this paper that will be out in the special issue of the Gerontologist, which actually did look also at our work during the pandemic. And one of the things that we noted in the paper that during COVID restrictions, just a lot fewer scales were administered. It's hard to do it over the phone. And there were a lot more cases that just didn't get addressed in a quality way that our APS workers wanted to. So when COVID restrictions were lifted, they were incredibly grateful to have that opportunity again to really provide the services that they needed. You know, vulnerable older people, vulnerable people of any kind, it's very high touch. You know, high tech is great, but it's very high touch. And those kinds of investigations require an incredible sensitivity, an incredible skill in communication, and a reassurance that, hey, it's okay to talk to me about this stuff. And that's really what APS workers told us was missing in Michigan during the COVID restrictions, like just so hard to get connected to people who are potential victims. Sorry, I used that word. What we found for implementation, we use a Paris model, and it's a fairly simple model, but I think it's important. It talked about two things: context. Why would you what makes the likely to use a new tool in the environment that you work in? So as Marie Ship, who's the APS administrator in our presentation at NAPS a couple weeks ago, said, yeah, we had just gotten audited and they decried the lack of our having risk assessment tools for older people. Well, I was knocking on the door maybe the next week, and just so happened, I didn't know that, but so there was a receptivity at the top level. Hey, this sounds great. You've done all this validity study with us. Let's implement it. But really, the facilitation is what makes it work. And we had great champions, and we spent a lot of time being a champion ourselves. But it all started at our website, olderadultnestegg.com, where people can get trained and certified. And we have narrated trainings and certifications, all at no charge to anybody that does it. We've had over 4,000 people trained on our tools now and certified from all kinds of professions. I'm proud to say maybe about 100 financial service providers now have been trained and certified, as well as about a dozen or two attorneys, lots of primary care folks, and a lot of APS workers as well. So this enabled us to do a statewide kind of training and trial. And also when new people come in, they can get trained fairly easily too. You don't have to go to a training session and wait for the next, you go online and really get it. So now we have all these tools for professionals. This is going to change as of today. We'll actually have a new tool out there, a new training on our vulnerability survey. But we also have a landing page for older adults and one for family and friends. But what I wanted to show you too was, I was curious, okay, what are the decisions people are making? I thought, how are we ever going to fit that into a table? It'd probably be like 100 different things, but it really came down to about 5 things. People giving a gift, okay? People making a purchase for someone, participating in a scam, allowing someone access to their money, or having someone take over control of their money. And, those aren't ever all or none bad things except participating in a scam. The others, it depends on the circumstances. And capacity plays a big part of that. And one of the things that we found that when the workers did use our tool and our site, they do receive feedback on what the scores mean, the risk score, and they had a high level of agreement with our scores. So 92% of the time they agreed exactly right. So we were very pleased about that. And we asked the question though, okay, those intellectual factors, all that's so important, but how powerful is just context alone in financial exploitation? Forget about asking about the actual decision. What can we know about just context? So we took our data from our big scale, which we give to everybody, no matter what study we're doing, because it breaks out into so many different pieces. And we had 78 people with confirmed financial exploitation. We compared them to a group of 168 same community people with no financial exploitation. We said, which items differentiate the two? And how well do they stick together? Well, 17 items differentiated the two, and they stuck together beautifully. It was amazing. We had 2 different people do the analysis because it was like, this is a little shady. It looks too good. You know, it's almost like a good clinical tool. We've cross-validated it, and it looks good there too. Not quite as robust, but still looks pretty darn good. Well, AARP found our tool and said, yeah, this is a number. Start off finding out how vulnerable you are. This is what this is. It's a financial vulnerability survey. You know, we launched this in December of 2020. And I have to thank David Brancaccio. He had me on his show. People know that show at all, in the morning on NPR. He does business interviews. And sure enough, that first month we got about 200 people came on and filled out our form. And actually that momentum has continued. We've had about 1,500 people. And I look at almost all of them, and I found that it kind of breaks out into 2 groups, I think. People wanting to be reassured that they're okay, because we get a lot of people very low risk, and people who are really desperate for some help, and we do offer help with our SAFE program. Interestingly, though, even though we offer it, even though it's right there, very few people will take the next step and ask for that help. So it's, again, it's those barriers, that taboo nature. So here are our items. I just want to share it with how worried about having enough money to pay for things. So we have a whole set of questions, about 8 questions that really get at the context of your finances. Financial strain, financial self-efficacy, and who manages your money, how satisfied are you with that? How often do you worry about financial decisions you've recently made? In our first study, when we were validating our scale, we found that this question really opened up stories by people who were getting financially exploited, or who had been, because they were ruminating about it quite a bit. Tell us about the decision. What are you worried about? So it's a good one to keep in your back pocket. How often your monthly expenses exceed your regular monthly income. And then we get into more of the psychological aspects around money. How often you wish you had someone to talk to about finances, anxious about your financial decisions. Do you have a confidant with whom you can discuss anything, including finances? Feeling downhearted and blue about finances. And then the final questions are really more about relationships. And this one is a fascinating one to me. Has a relationship with a family member or friend become strained due to finances as you've grown older? That is a very specific question. And it's amazing to me. I think it's about 1 in 5 in our data say yes. Wow, that's a big number. And that like, what's going on? Did anyone ever tell you that someone else wants to take your money, or how likely is it that someone wants to take your money? In other words, so about 7 of these items are what we call critical items, and we now are going to have this user's guide on our website for this. So those are all self-report. So it's kind of a quick and dirty kind of risk scale. But if you're going to use it as a professional, then these critical items are good ones to follow up on and really get some more details. So older people themselves can go right on the landing page, fill that out, and professionals now can also do that and have an older person fill it out, and it'll come back to the professional's account. Last thing I want to tell you about is just our study. Pam was talking about the 40,000 foot level. I'm at the 0 foot level. Show me your checkbook. Why? Because I'm really nervous about the 30,000 foot level of the finding Angrasani and Lee. People who had memory loss had wealth loss, significant wealth loss. And most of them didn't even know, probably, that they had memory loss. Or at least they didn't get it evaluated. And so we're doing the wallet study. I have to say, the first funding I got was from a foundation that's been very generous to me over the years. But before they gave me the money, the program officer wrote me and said, "We're worried you can't do the study. Who is going to let you see 12 months of their checking statements?" To which I said, and I can't believe I had the gall to say it, "Nancy, I've been in the community for 25 years. If I can't do it, nobody can. Don't we want to find out? So just give me the money and we'll find out. It'll be the big experiment." This month, she said to me, "I should have known that this was where we're on a roll." We published our first paper with 46, just a feasibility study, but we're at about 105 now, and we're going at a fast clip, which is really interesting, right? People want to know, how am I doing with my finances? I'm not really tracking it. Or they want to confirm, I'm doing pretty good, aren't I? I really have these processes in place, which is kind of back to my original thing. There's a lot of anxiety about finances. And so we've learned kind of how to go through somebody's statements, draw up questions to then get verification on things that we've kind of indicated, what's jumping out to us. What did you spend the $7,500 on January of 2021? Like what? Yeah, I know your life now. And it's actually been very rewarding to talk to people and very revealing to us. Some of our early findings have been that helping other people, especially those who have some memory loss, we're getting people early with memory loss and comparing them with people with no memory loss. If they're helping others financially on a regular basis, they're not tracking that as well. And that's where considerable wealth loss is coming. So I'm getting the sign, which is right on. And I want to thank you for having me. And I am more than interested in your questions and comments. They're coming, Jill. She's right over there. Everybody needs to hear you. Oh yeah, microphones are great.
Get here. So Peter, I'm very curious, looking both at your own data that you collected and the HRS data, which may make the question I'm going to raise a little more feasible to address. I'm curious what you have found in terms of the role of race, gender, and marital status in predicting financial exploitation.
Thank you for your questions. The Health and Retirement Survey data, we didn't find any race differences. We have in our own data, and so has Scott Beach, and so has Lawman, have found higher rates in African Americans than in non-Hispanic whites. In terms of marriage, and especially, we didn't find that either in the fraud data in the national sample, but we definitely are seeing in our own data and in the data that comes in on the financial vulnerability side that not being partnered can be a risk factor. We did some analyses on our web data, which we hope it's accurate, but I mean we're asking very personal questions, so we're getting good information that way. Memory loss and living alone were the two predictors. And when they intersected, it really skyrocketed the financial vulnerability. So thank you. Context matters so much in these situations.
In gender, did you find any differences if you're controlling on those other factors?
Yeah, and so just putting that on top with gender, so many more women were living alone and experiencing memory loss in that regard.
Okay, thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
In listening to your talks, since I was at the NAPSA conference also, looking at this from, I'm trained as a geriatric nurse practitioner. So historically, we haven't screened for cognitive decline as a prevention or early detection practice.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we probably should. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are as far as
It's complicated.
integrating a regular cognitive screening and/or the vulnerability survey, especially in older adult.
Yeah. Cognitive screening gets very complicated, I think. It's important to screen, and I do think in many ways, self-report, informant, maybe some objective assessment, not isolated. But I do think, and thank you for asking, because we've been involved in a planning grant with a medical practice that are doing exactly that. And what we found is that 3/4 of people approached have taken the financial vulnerability survey. And about 40% are showing some vulnerability, significantly above our cut scores. So our next goal is to put a prevention program in place where we start out by identifying higher risk people. We use the AARP roadmap a little bit, use some of our other stuff to educate as well, and see if we can't move the needle on some vulnerabilities, susceptibility, scams, and hopefully exploitation. But yeah, I'd be happy to talk with you more about how you can use this screening. It's a social determinant of health, and some of our other papers using the national HRS data are really just about how finance is so integral with mental and physical health in older age. And so it really does need to be part and parcel of healthcare, I think.
Hi, I was just curious if you've done any research on the intersectionality between financial exploitation and that impact in guardianship cases, and then also your opinion on how this tool can either help potential guardianship cases or possibly lead to overly restrictive or unnecessary guardianships.
Great. Thank you very much for your question. So I use our tools when I assess for some guardianship cases. Often they're being contested, and so I come in and do an independent evaluation. And I find it helpful. We in Michigan have an elder abuse task force that's focused on financial exploitation, and some of our tools are becoming part of their curriculum that they want to train guardian ad litems on and guardians in terms of understanding informed decision making in this realm. But the heart of your question is it going to be overly restrictive or not? And that really lies in the hands of the person that's administrating. These are tools, but the biggest difference is the skill of the interviewer. Whenever you're talking about a tool like this. And so that's what we got the Pam Teasters for, to help us understand, how do we promote autonomy where possible and not be overly protective, because when we're overly protective, it can be equally harmful.
Peter, this was a great talk. I am curious about a very simple matter, check books versus electronic checking.
Thank you.
Can you make sense of that for me?
I can, actually. We're learning a lot about, too, just the way personal finance is managed is so different. Like, so many people don't use cash at all. or if they do, they get some from the CVS when they, get cash back. So you can't track withdrawals or anything like that. Just doesn't seem very important. Again, about half of our sample uses electronic, and we love them because easy to de-identify and get their statements. And about half, we have to get their physical statements and de-identify them. So it's still a combination. But most people are using major credit cards for a lot. These points matter a lot. And so people are using credit cards or debit cards quite a bit. We are not seeing a lot of checks written. So it's really changing the nature of it. We do ask about like how often do you look and so forth. I don't believe any of the responses I'm getting. I just don't. I think it's a social desirability. Oh yeah, I check all the time. I don't think so. We'll have to see what the data actually say. But my sense is that people say they check much more often than they do, because when I interview them, they're like, "Oh, I hadn't realized that. Thank you for that tip." You're spending 25% of your money on phones every month. Oh, okay. Hadn't thought about that. So I call it checkbook. I shouldn't. Check statements. And the other thing that's really bad is that banks and credit unions make it very hard for you to get your old statements. Very hard. We actually pay for the fees that some of these banks and credit unions give. They'll maybe give free up to 6 months, maybe, and we'll say, okay, we'll pay for the rest. But that's a bad thing, because how are you going to get a sense of the patterns of your expenditures if you can't get back a hold of it? And just looking, you're not going to keep all this paper. So it's really, really eye-opening. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Glad to see you back. And each year, the Center on Aging in the Life course confers an award. And that award rotates from research to instruction and to service. And this year, we're going to focus on research excellence. It is my pleasure, you've seen it in your booklets, but it's my pleasure to announce that this year's Research Excellence Award is conferred on Roland Thorpe. And Roland is professor of health, behavior, and society at the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health. Roland earned his bachelor's degree in mathematics from Florida A&M University. Then he came to Purdue and earned an MS in statistics and a PhD in epidemiology. And he completed the gerontology minor. I met Roland when he was a graduate student working in Purdue's Statistical Consulting Laboratory. And I found him to be a careful thinker, a positive person when working through statistical problems, and a wonderful collaborator. While he was still here at Purdue, he was able to garner an NIH F31 fellowship, and that led to a transition to Johns Hopkins University as a postdoc. And I like to think that he's flourished like a pecan tree in Macon, Georgia, from which he hails. You know, a pecan's a hardwood, and Roland is very solid. The National Library of Medicine shows that Dr. Thorpe is the author of over 250 journal articles in top-tier outlets such as the American Journal of Epidemiology, Ethnicity and Health, Innovation in Aging, Journal of Aging and Health, Journal of Gerontology, JAMA Internal Medicine, and the Gerontologist. I could go on. It's quite a list. And let me remind you that this is a 2004 PhD, so in 18 years, that's a pretty productive scholar. The themes of his publications really focus on two items. Number one, eliminating health disparities by race and socioeconomic status. And secondly, investigating health among minority men, which led him to serve as the founding director of the program on men's health research at Johns Hopkins. It's also obvious that Roland is a generous man because he shares what he knows with graduate students, with postdoctoral fellows, and junior faculty. By combining research, interests, he is helping to prepare the next generation of diverse scholars in gerontology. He's also now Associate Vice Provost of Faculty Diversity, which is another extension of his mentoring. And using Web of Science, I found that there are more than 6,000 citations to Roland's work. 39 of his articles have been cited at least 39 times, and those numbers would be probably double that on Google Scholar. It's pretty clear to see that Roland Thorpe has flourished, and this is a remarkable record of research achievement. We at Purdue celebrate Roland's accomplishments, and we have an exceptional scholar in our midst. We look forward to his future contributions related to health disparities. Please join me in honoring Professor Roland Thorpe as our 2022 Research Excellence Award. Thank you, Roland.
Thank you. So first, I like to, before I get started, I wanted to do some thank yous. I want to thank my alma mater for acknowledging the work that I've done to this date, and I also want to thank the Center Aging in Life course, particularly Paige Eber for, I know I didn't answer all the emails in a timely manner, but we got here. I don't know where she is in the room, but I really appreciate your patience. And I also just want to thank you, Ken, for all that you've poured into me and all that you've done for me to be successful as a scholar. I just want to take a moment to tell you a brief story. I hail from Macon, Georgia. Everywhere I go, I let people know that. One little secret, I have to tell you the secret, Pam, because I enjoyed your mountain story. We have the best cherry blossoms in the world. So the ones down in DC, they're second place to the ones in Macon. Just saying. But I want to take this moment to, on a more serious note, I want to take this moment is that this is quite an honor, particularly getting it from your home. What the idea is to let people go. Once you train them, let them go, and they carry your legacy on. And then when I got the phone call from Ken to share with me that this honor would be bestowed upon me, I was very, very, very honored to accept the award, and it was very easy to accept the award. One thing I want to say to the students out there is that I'm an example of it does finally work. I know Dr. George McCabe is in here. He was very integral in my career, my success, because he was the first person I met coming from Florida A&M. I meet George in the Department of Statistics, and I work with him. He showed me what it was like to be a consultant, and he introduced me to Ken Ferraro. And it was with Ken, working with Ken, that I understood that aging is important. And not only understanding that aging is important, and that aging and the aging process at that time, it might differentially affect different race and sex groups. And today we know, based on the work that he's done and some of the work that we've done, we have evidence to show that that is the case. And this award, while it's given to me, I want to also acknowledge that it is a part of some of the giants that have stood before me. We've had these wonderful presentations. I've had the opportunity now to work with Peter with some postdocs, learn how to work with postdocs throughout distances. I also wanted to acknowledge that the other people that have made my journey a little bit easier. There's Dr. Larry Glickman, Dr. Regina Kreishley, Dr. Alan Beck has made it. these are the people at Purdue, and then I know I'm gonna miss someone, so I'm gonna stop there. And I'm gonna say the other colleagues that are beyond Purdue University, but I would be remiss not to acknowledge the late, great Judy Casper, who has provided, she was one of the leaders of NHATS data set. And I wanted to acknowledge her because she's been integral through my process of promotion and tenure at Johns Hopkins. So I wanted to say that. And finally, to the students at Works, take the advice from your advisors and your mentors, and just know that this research allows me to continue to pour my legacy in to the students that I have the opportunity to touch. Thank you so much.
We can do that in a bit. But, let me introduce Melissa Franks, Professor Melissa Franks, who will introduce our next speaker.
Unlike Peter, I don't have a soft voice, so I'm going to hold it way down here. And first, I want to congratulate Roland. Just made my day. Outstanding. I am Melissa Franks, and I am an Associate Director of the Center for Families here at Purdue University, and it is my pleasure this morning to introduce our next speaker, James Appleby. And I want to take a moment to draw your attention to the program that's available, and if you don't have one, there's plenty up here in the front, because there's more information in there that I just want to hit some of the highlights to introduce James. And James is currently the CEO of the Gerontological Society of America. And if you are not familiar with the Gerontological Society of America and you want to know more about it, he wants you to know. He put it right in his bio. Here I am, let me tell you about the organization I lead. So take a look at that. He also is a member of the National Advisory Council on Aging, and he was appointed to that position by the U.S. Secretary for Health and Human Services. And his training is in pharmacy, and he also received an MPH from Temple University. And before he joined GSA, because Gerontological Society of America can get to be a mouthful when you say it a lot, so we call it GSA. He held several other leadership positions in organizations, including the American Pharmacists Association, where he was the Chief Operating Officer. And I also want to mention another role that James has at GSA, and he is leading the Reframing Aging in America initiative. And there's a little bit more you can learn about that at the GSA website, but I'll give you a little bit. And this initiative, and maybe he'll be talking about it this morning, I'm not sure, is designed to improve how we understand what aging means and ways to recognize the contributions of older adults in our society. And as the final introduction, I want to thank all of our wonderful speakers this morning. We're so happy to have you here for this symposium. I am super excited about the leadership of GSA with Peter and James, but I got a little nervous yesterday, I have to tell you. I was in a conversation at a group event last evening with some of you, and I found out that it took them 3 days to get to West Lafayette from Indianapolis. If that worries you, James suggested talk to him at the break and he'll fill you in. So welcome, James, and we're really looking forward to your talk.
Well, thank you, Melissa. And indeed, it is a good story. If you're up for a good story at the lunch break, we'll be happy to share why it took us 3 days to get all the way from Indianapolis to here. no horses were involved or anything like that. There is a good reason. Thank you. It is an absolute honor and privilege to be able to be here with you today to share a few thoughts around how we can reframe elder abuse. We've had a couple of wonderful talks to set the stage, and they've really helped to sort of lay the groundwork for a couple of the items I want to touch upon. The idea of context was mentioned, so let me just tell you a little bit about my personal background in that I grew up in rural Pennsylvania and spent the first 20 years of my life there, so I'm very comfortable with cornfields, and I still spend about 50% of my time there. My family is there, so I'm back and forth a lot, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, so it's like being home here. The rest of my time is spent in Washington, D.C., where GSA's headquarters are located, and where we do our work, and the amazing 24-member staff at GSA. Before I begin, I want to say congratulations to Dr. Thorpe, to Roland. He talks about legacy, right? That you do, scholars do, and that you leave a legacy of mentors, etc. Well, he clearly brings immense respect to the gerontology, aging sciences, the center here at Purdue. But you should also be quite aware that he is very active at the national stage through the Gerontological Society of America, through GSA. I've had the privilege to work personally with Roland on multiple major endeavors. Diversity and Justice Working Group that he chaired for us most recently has made extraordinary recommendations that have strengthened GSA. It's just an honor to work with you, Roland, so congratulations again. And your national role, I think, is something that I wanted to highlight in addition to your work as an alumni of Purdue. And if I could take a minute too, just to quickly recognize two other members of the Purdue family who have a major impact on the national scale as well. And one we've heard from already, a speaker, Peter Lichtenberg, GSA president, and he is not just president this year, he was vice president last year, he's a member of the board. Next year he'll be board chair. After that he'll be involved with our governance committee for 4 years beyond that. So another example of a Purdue alumni, double alum, who is having an impact on the national scale. And finally, Ken Ferraro. Ken has put this together, such a wonderful symposium, but what many of you may not know is that Ken is the recipient of the GSA Kleemeyer Award. The Kleemeyer Award is for outstanding and sustained excellence in the field of gerontological scholarship. And Ken's lifelong contributions to the field in the area of health disparities and stress, as well as developing multiple conceptual models around aging, is what has led him to be recognized with this Kleemeyer Award. And for anyone who is interested, he will be giving his Kleemeyer Award lecture during the GSA annual scientific meeting in Indianapolis in early November. So I encourage you to come along and hear his remarks. So with that, let's turn to the topic of the day. And what I'll be doing is wrapping up the symposium by talking about this issue of reframing elder abuse. And what you say, what's reframing elder abuse? Well, it's really a different way to talk about this issue based upon extensive research that was done with consumers, with the public, a different way to talk that helps to better describe the situation in a helpful, positive way that can get individuals more interested in helping out instead of just throwing up their hands and saying we can't do anything about it. All right, so it's based upon research. The research was done with consumers. Based upon that research, the experts went out and tested different interventions, different ways of talking about elder abuse to find out which one resonates the best, which one leads to the most positive outcome with consumers, to understand what the issue is and to help us all make a difference. So that's what the talk is about. I'm just going to give you a little taste, a little flavor for it, because the training around how to talk using this new language, and there aren't amazing words here you haven't heard before, it's just when you put them together with the right frame, they have a different impact. Words matter. right? I'm just going to give you a little taste for something that typically we would do over the course of a day-long training, all right? So that's what today's about. The National Center to Reframe Aging is up in the left-hand corner of this slide. That's based at GSA, all right? I'm going to tell you a little bit about that because that was the foundation upon which the work to reframe elder abuse was built. So I've got to give you that foundation, and then from that tell you a little bit about reframing elder abuse. And then I'm going to end with a video, a 3-minute video, an animated video that captures all of this into one place, and hopefully will give you a sense as to how this idea of framing how we talk about elder abuse can help. So with that said, reframing aging, and Melissa touched on this a little bit. Reframing aging is the concept that right now the public thinks about aging in one way. Experts, based upon research and science, know the facts to be a different way. And we've got to figure out how to bridge that gap. And so the Reframing Aging Initiative was created. It's now about 6 years old. And again, this is based upon research. The research was done to understand what consumers know about aging. Different interventions were created, different ways to talk about aging, to see which ones would increase levels of support for the issue. And it's very helpful, especially if you're in the advocacy or policy realm, right? So that's what reframing aging is about. It's a long-term social change endeavor. We're not going to fix this issue regarding how aging is perceived in America in a short term. We're hoping to do it in a generation or 2 or 3. We'll see. So why is it that we need to reframe aging? And this gives you a sense of it. This is based upon the research conducted. If you see on the left, this is what the aging field believes to be true about reframing, about aging. And on the right is what the public believes. And I'll just point out a couple of examples. How should we approach aging? The public generally says, battle it. We should fight aging, all right? Whereas the researchers say, yeah, we should really embrace aging. In fact, research shows that those who have a more positive outlook on aging live up to 7.5 years longer, right? Going down here, who's responsible for the outcomes? Well, most of the public thinks it's just the individual. It's individual choices that determine what the outcome is. Again, as researchers and scholars, people in this room involved in aging know that it's a lot of other things. It's the environment. It's not just individual choices, all right? So we've got to figure out how to bridge between these two. The topic of ageism, is that a concern? The general public is not even aware of ageism based upon the research that's been done. It's called a cognitive hole versus the aging field knows it's an issue. So just to give you a sense, those are the sorts of things and why it is we need to talk differently about aging. This work, the Reframe Aging, was not something that GSA did by itself. We're actually doing it with 9 other aging organizations. So just to let you know, this is something the entire aging field is behind and trying to implement to come up with this new way of talking about aging. And all of our hopes is that will help us when we're trying to get age-friendly policies approved on Capitol Hill. And it's supported by private philanthropy. 4 major funders at the national level are behind making this happen, and we're just delighted with it. So why does framing matter? What is framing? Why does it matter? Well, framing is when you're telling a story, and you all do this naturally, especially if something happened and you got to go tell your boss some bad news, you say, how am I going to frame this to my professor, right? All the data's been lost. What do I do? You figure out what you want to emphasize, right? What parts you want to talk about, how are you going to explain it, like what happened, and then you also decide what to leave unsaid, because sometimes it's better to leave things out because giving too much information confuses the issue or it sort of undermines your argument. So that's what we're about when we're talking about reframing aging, how we talk about the topic in a way that doesn't cue the wrong cognitive model in our minds, right? We all have different cognitive models we grow up with, and if you use language that cues someone to think, oh, I can't do anything about aging at all, it's going to be what it's going to be, that's not going to be helpful if you're trying to convince someone to implement a new age-friendly policy, right? So we've got to be careful about how we frame things. And how does it work? Well, how we talk about an issue affects how we think about an issue. So we need to begin to use a different language when talking about aging so that when others start to talk about it, they do that as well. As we use different language, it starts to change how people think about aging. Ultimately, we hope, leading to changes in behavior, both in practice, but also ultimately in policy change. And I'll tell you the good news is, very quickly, and a couple of citations are up here, the research shows it works. Interventions, for example, to reduce ageism work. And there's a lovely article in the American Journal of Public Health that does a review of this, as well as interventions to get at implicit age bias, which virtually everyone has an implicit age bias. But it's shown that interventions based upon this work change individuals' implicit age bias. So I encourage you to check out those references. One of my two objectives at the end is that you will note this website. Melissa gave it a heads up, I appreciate that. Reframingaging.org, there are a lot of resources there. You can go, there are tutorials, you can learn more about the interventions. There's a number of resources. On the left-hand side, you'll see the communication best practices that you may find helpful. There's a quick start guide, things to watch out for, things to do, things to not do. So with that, that's the background. Let me shift over to this issue of reframing elder abuse. The situation is this: as we were doing our research, the Administration for Community Living got wind of it and said, you know, this is really great stuff. Kathy Greenlee, she said, this is great stuff. Can we somehow work with your research, maybe do some more research, because I really want to do something about elder abuse. And so additional funding was allocated, a bunch of new research was done, focused on this topic, building on the initial findings that we did around reframing aging. Right. So that work was done, the interventions were tested, and they've now decided on what works best to garner more support to talk about this issue in a meaningful way. And that's what I'll share with you. And I'll mention that this work is based at the National Center on Elder Abuse at the Keck School of Medicine at USC. This National Center, and many of you are well aware of it, it's been around for quite some time, it is all about providing information regarding policy and research and training, et cetera, to individuals involved in the area of elder justice. This just gives you a sense of just some of the resources that are available at the NCEA. If you haven't used the website before, I'd ask you to note that website as well. That's my second objective, that you have actually been, aware of it, number one, and maybe go and peruse the site and see if there are some tools there that will be helpful to you. Now you say, well, so what did that research show that made you think you had to reframe this, how we talk about elder abuse? Well, this is what a slide that quickly captures some of the big disconnects between what the public believes and what experts know to be true. In the upper left-hand side, the consumer thinks about it as two different things. It's elder plus abuse. And they really indicated that they didn't even see that elder neglect qualified as elder abuse. Right? They also had a real sort of hard time getting their heads around sexual abuse. Like, what? On the lower right-hand side, the consumers that were interviewed really spotlight everything about it being about an individual. It's what some sicko does. It's some child who wants to have payback to their parent, etc. It's about greed. And then lastly, on the lower left, consumers indicated, well, it's really, that's just modern life. You can't do anything about it because nursing homes are an unfortunate necessity. We had some conversation around nursing homes earlier, and it's our culture, right? So these are the sort of the challenges that were encountered. And when the experts looked at that and then built their interventions around it, they came up with this approach of, okay, here's our frame, here's our metaphor, that we need to get away from this idea that it's all about the individual, right? We need to somehow point out that this is about what all of us do, how we can all contribute, all right? And so they built this, and this is an image that you'll see in a moment, that it's all around policies and programs, and we build a structure. And anytime you're trying to tell a good story, it's good to have a metaphor, all right? And this is the metaphor, the structure that underlines the policies and programs that will help to reduce elder abuse. To give you a little hint of what you're about to see, here are the do's and the don'ts when talking about the topic of elder abuse. You should appeal to justice, and in fact, the value that you'll see in the video, it's all built on the value of a justice, right? Avoid appealing to sympathy, right? Talk about the importance of social connectedness is good. Avoid talking about vulnerable populations. Again, this is what the research that is showing. Demonstrate a collective solution. We're all in this together. We all have a role to play versus crisis-laden communications. They recommend using this social structure metaphor, which you'll see, and explain this underlying social conditions that increase the risk factors, and try to do that versus focusing on the individual perpetrator or the victim, all right? So that's the do's and don'ts, and hopefully you'll see it as we share this video with you. And just take a minute for it to load, I believe, and I'll ask our sound experts in the back to make sure that everyone can hear it whenever it comes up.
A just society works to make sure everyone is free from the threat of abuse at every stage of life. To live up to our ideal of justice for all, we need to work to address the social issue of elder abuse. It's important to understand what creates the risk of experiencing abuse or neglect as we age. A strong and just society is like a structure, supported by many beams. We need strong beams that are frequently maintained. You can think of these beams as the policies and programs that reinforce the relationships and resources needed for health, happiness, and safety. When those support beams are missing or not maintained, the structure is weaker and may not meet our expectations that people are able to live free from maltreatment. The first and most important step to prevent elder abuse is to reduce social isolation. George, age 77, reminds us why this is important. George spends most of his time at home alone since his wife died. His daughter lives too far away to visit regularly, and his neighborhood lacks reliable public transit and many age-friendly civic spaces. Fewer social interactions mean fewer opportunities for walking, talking, and laughing. And with these normal, healthy experiences missing, George's physical, cognitive, and emotional health have gotten worse. His daughter does not know what she can do or where she can turn for help. Without the structure of support, it's easy to see how if George encountered an unsafe situation, the problem might go unnoticed. George's story of social isolation is not uncommon. With millions of our fellow Americans living in similar situations, it's fair to say that our nation's social structure needs repair. Just as one beam alone can't support a building, individuals and family members alone can't single-handedly manage the problem of social isolation and the corresponding risk of maltreatment. The good news is that there are many ways to strengthen our social supports through policies, services, and programs that keep us integrated in our communities as we age. We can design and equip community centers to work as intergenerational spaces that allow older people to build relationships and participate in the work, play, and life of our neighborhoods. We can think about the role of transportation and reducing social isolation and adjust systems so that we can all continue to move throughout our communities as we age. We can figure out new and better ways to arrange and coordinate the teams, agencies, and programs that specifically work with older people. We can develop programs to educate families and professionals who work with older adults to understand the importance of preventing isolation, how to spot the warning signs of maltreatment, and what to do to address abuse or neglect. By doing all we can to strengthen the social support structure, we can reduce social isolation, protect communities and families against elder abuse, and build a nation that lives up to our promise of justice for all. Learn more and see how you can get involved in preventing elder abuse and promoting greater justice for older people at ncea.acl.gov.
All right, so that gives you a sense as to how the communications experts involved have sort of pulled together this story. It's grounded in a value of justice. They come up with a metaphor and this idea of the structures that hold everything up, all these different pieces that have to work together. No one beam can hold up the entire situation for George. And then it ends with concrete recommendations, real solutions in terms of community centers, improved transportation, taking steps to address social isolation. So that's how the story is told. And if you check out the NCEA website, you can get a better sense of the additional training materials they have to help use things such as the do's and don'ts guide that I shared with you, as sort of a quick start guide, as well as other tools to begin talking in a different way about elder abuse that brings everybody into the picture. It's not just one individual at a time. We all have a role to play. And it's based upon, again, the initial work from Reframing Aging that GSA and 9 other national organizations are behind. With that, I'll say thank you for your attention, and happy to take any questions. Yes, Melissa.
So the video and the organization, where is that information, who's that information shared with? Is it directed toward the public, toward policymakers, researchers, all of us?
It's available for anyone. So it's at NCEA. If you go and see it, you can, NCEA has training programs to help understand how to use the tools. So it's available to anyone, yes. So again, if you have not checked out this before, I encourage you to look at it. And again, I want to reinforce that there's no like, oh, say these different words and suddenly everything's better. This is a deliberative process. It's about being intentional about how we frame communications so that we don't turn off the listener. If the listener immediately thinks, and the analogy I'll use is with talking about aging, reframing aging, talking to policymakers. If you go into a policymaker and you say, oh, there's a silver tsunami coming, all these aging individuals, what are we going to do? And the person coming in and talking thinks that they're getting the attention of the staff member on Capitol Hill. No, staff members just said, oh, well, I can't do anything about that then. Who's next? Who do I talk to? And so we've got to think of a different way, all right? For scholars out there, how many articles start, by 2050, 30 million people are going to have this or that, right? Again, that's a real showstopper. If you're an advocate trying to get people's attention, you have to be having conversations about, as we all live longer and healthier lives, we have to think about this and think about that because, okay, that makes sense. We're all living longer, healthier lives. So it's about being intentional with our words. So if you look at some of this and sort of shake your head like, really, is that going to do anything? In one day it won't, but as people adopt the language and as scholars adopt it as well, I think maybe that's an important point I should make. I think it's really important that scholars think really hard about this and think about how they can integrate, how we can all integrate this into scholarly language because that will help the next generation of scholars as they begin to write about it to pick up this language as well. So thank you, Melissa. Any other questions? Ken, do I turn it over to you?
Has it been a good morning? I think it's been a great morning. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Your presence has enriched all of us with some great questions and some fabulous presentations. Thanks to each of our speakers. I also want to thank a few others who have really helped to make today happen. First off, we had a program committee this year that was included Paige Ebner. Where is Paige? There she is right in the back, always standing guard, making sure everything is going well. Marion Liu and Weilin Zhu. Where is Weilin? There she is, yes. Thank you so much. You get the picture when your speakers rave about how they're treated on campus and what have you. And this team just did a marvelous job structuring the day and attending to our comfort and beautifying us with flowers on tables and things of that sort. So it's really special. I also want to give a call out to our student volunteers, running mics and registering people and timekeeping, you know, behind the scenes, but they're really just doing a very, very important job. So we're really thankful for that. I want to ask you to do one thing for us, and that is to give us some feedback on how today's proceedings were judged by you. And so we will transition to lunch, but please feel free to fill out your evaluation form, and you can drop it at the registration table. You also can drop your name tags after lunch. So I'm not going to go on. I'm going to say it's time for lunch. Buon appetito. Thank you.